May 8, 1942, 180 miles northeast of Tulagi, Solomon Islands, the torpedo struck USS Yorktown's port side at 11:27 a.m. with a concussion that lifted men off their feet 3 decks above the impact point. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Aldrich felt the carrier shudder beneath him as seawater exploded inward through ruptured hull plates, flooding 2 fire rooms and knocking out 5 of the ship's 9 boilers. The 19,800-ton carrier immediately lost power to her port shaft and began listing 4 degrees to port. Captain Elliot Buckmaster gripped the bridge railing as damage reports crackled over the intercom. They were in the middle of the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Japanese dive bombers were still circling overhead like vultures waiting for the kill. Yorktown had already taken 1 bomb hit earlier that morning, punching through the flight deck and detonating 3 decks down. 66 men were dead. The ship was trailing smoke visible for 30 miles. Below decks, damage control parties were already moving. Chief Water Tender Charles Kleinsmith waded through knee-deep water in Fire Room Number 1, the emergency lighting casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The compartment was a maze of ruptured steam lines and flooding spaces. He could hear the ocean pouring in through the torpedo hole, a roar like standing behind a waterfall. They had maybe 10 minutes before the weight of all that seawater pulled the carrier down by the bow. "Get those pumps running," Kleinsmith shouted over the din. His men were already connecting emergency submersible pumps, dragging heavy electrical cables through the flooding spaces. The torpedo had blown a hole roughly 10 feet across in the ship's side. There was no patching that. Not out here, not with enemy aircraft overhead and the nearest dry dock 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor. On the flight deck, aviation machinist mate John Lundstrom helped push a burning SPE Dauntless over the side. The dive bomber had been caught in the blast from the bomb hit, its fuselage twisted and smoking. You couldn't land aircraft on a deck covered in wreckage and fire. They'd already lost 3 planes. Now they were fighting to save the ship herself. The list was getting worse. 4 degrees became 5, then 6. Kleinsmith's damage control party worked with water rising past their waists, moving by feel in spaces where the lights had failed completely. They managed to seal off the worst flooding, using every trick in the Navy's damage control manual. Shore up bulkheads with wooden beams, plug smaller holes with mattresses and life jackets. Counterflood compartments on the starboard side to bring the ship back to level. It took 3 hours of desperate work, but Yorktown stopped listing. The pumps gained ground on the flooding. Engineers managed to restart 4 of the knocked-out boilers, bringing the carrier speed back up to 20 knots. Not full power, not by a long shot, but enough to keep her moving, enough to keep her in the fight. Buckmaster stood on the bridge wing, watching his crew work with a mixture of pride and disbelief. They'd taken a torpedo that should have sent them limping back to Pearl Harbor for months of repairs. Instead, their men had jerry-rigged solutions out of damage control equipment and sheer determination. Yorktown was hurt, bleeding oil and listing slightly, even with counterflooding in place, but she was still operational. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended the next day. Yorktown had helped turn back a Japanese invasion force headed for Port Moresby, New Guinea. The Imperial Japanese Navy retreated north, but they'd given as good as they got. The American carrier Lexington lay at the bottom of the Coral Sea, scuttled after taking multiple torpedo and bomb hits. Yorktown herself looked like she'd been through a meat grinder. When the carrier limped into Pearl Harbor on May 27th, Navy inspectors estimated she'd need at least 3 months of repairs before she could return to combat. The bomb damage alone was extensive. The torpedo hit had wrecked 2 boilers beyond field repair and left the whole structure weakened along 20 feet of the port side. Electrical systems were compromised, watertight integrity was questionable. This was dry dock work, the kind of repairs that took specialized equipment and hundreds of skilled workers. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the pier looking up at the battered carrier. He had other plans. His intelligence officers had broken Japanese naval codes and knew another major operation was coming. The Japanese were planning to attack Midway Island, and they were bringing every carrier they had. Nimitz needed every flat top he could scrap together, even ones that by all rights should be in dry dock for the next 90 days. He gave the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard 72 hours. What followed was one of the most remarkable repair jobs in naval history. 1,400 workers swarmed over Yorktown around the clock. They didn't try to fix everything. They couldn't. Instead, they focused on making the carrier combat-capable again. Welders patched the bomb damage, engineers jerry-rigged repairs to the damaged boilers, knowing the fixes wouldn't last, but hoping they'd hold for one more battle. Electricians rewired damaged systems, running cables through different routes when the original ones were too badly damaged to repair quickly. The work never stopped. Day shift became night shift without no break in between. Sparks from welding torches lit up the darkness, the smell of fresh paint mixed with fuel oil and metal shavings. Supply trucks rumbled onto the pier every hour with parts cannibalized from other ships. When they couldn't find the right replacement parts, workers fabricated new ones in the yard's machine shops. Commander Aldrich watched the organized chaos from the flight deck. He'd seen Navy Yard repair jobs before, but nothing like this. Normally, workers were methodical, following strict procedures and quality control standards. This was different. This was desperation dressed up as efficiency. They were putting Band-Aids on wounds that needed surgery, and everyone knew it. But it was working. Slowly, impossibly, Yorktown was coming back together. The welders worked in pairs, one man holding a patch plate against the torn hull, while his partner ran beads of molten metal to seal it in place. Inside the damaged compartments, other crews shored up weakened bulkheads with steel I-beams cut to length in the yard's fabrication shop. They weren't restoring Yorktown to her original strength. They were buying time, creating just enough structural integrity to keep the ocean out and the ship afloat for one more engagement. In Fire Room Number 1, the space where Chief Kleinsmith and his men had fought the flooding at Coral Sea, civilian engineers assessed the 2 destroyed boilers. Complete replacement was impossible in 72 hours. Hell, it was barely possible in 72 days. Instead, they sealed off the damaged units and rerouted steam lines to work around them. Yorktown would sail with 7 boilers instead of 9. Her top speed would drop from 32 knots to maybe 28. In a carrier battle where position and maneuverability meant everything, those missing knots could be fatal. Captain Buckmaster knew the risks. He also knew the alternative was sitting in Pearl Harbor while the Japanese fleet steamed unopposed towards Midway. On the evening of May 29th, just 48 hours into the repair job, he walked through the ship with Commander Aldrich inspecting the work. They squeezed past workers cutting away damaged plating in a passageway, stepped over welding cables snaking across the deck, breathed air thick with paint fumes and metal shavings. "She'll hold," Aldrich said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. Buckmaster ran his hand along a freshly welded patch. The metal was still warm. "She'd better." The flight deck repairs were moving faster. Workers had cut away the bomb-damaged section and welded new plating in its place, then covered everything with fresh teak decking. From a distance, you could barely tell where the bomb had hit. Up close, you could see the newer wood was a slightly different shade, and the deck plates underneath didn't quite match the originals, but it would hold aircraft. That was all that mattered. By the morning of May 30th, 72 hours after pulling into Pearl Harbor, Yorktown was ready to sail. Ready was perhaps too strong a word. She was operational, combat capable, held together with welds that hadn't been stress tested, powered by a boiler arrangement that violated every engineering manual in the Navy, crewed by men who had barely had time to sleep while the repairs went on around them. Admiral Nimitz came aboard that morning for a final inspection. He walked the flight deck, peered down into the hangar bay where mechanics were running final checks on the carrier's aircraft, visited the bridge where Buckmaster and his officers were studying charts of the waters around Midway. The Admiral asked few questions. He knew what he was looking at. A carrier that should have been in dry dock for 3 months, patched together in 3 days, about to sail into what intelligence suggested would be the largest naval engagement of the Pacific War. "Good luck, Captain," Nimitz simply said, shaking Buckmaster's hand. Yorktown departed Pearl Harbor at 9 a.m., black smoke trailing from her stacks as the repaired boilers built up steam. She rendezvoused with Task Force 17 and turned northwest towards Midway. The Japanese were coming with 4 fleet carriers, Akigi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The Americans would meet them with 3, Enterprise, Hornet, and a patched up Yorktown that by all rights shouldn't have been there at all.
The next 5 days were spent in transit, the carrier cutting through moderate seas at 24 knots. Below decks, engineers monitored the repaired systems constantly. The jury-rigged steam lines held. The patched hull plates didn't leak. The strengthened bulkheads bore the stress of the ship's passage through the water. But everyone knew these fixes were temporary. They'd been designed to last for one battle, not a prolonged campaign. After Midway, Yorktown would need to return to Pearl Harbor for the proper 3-month repair job, assuming she survived Midway. On the morning of June 4th, Yorktown's radar picked up incoming aircraft at 7:15 a.m. Japanese scouts from the enemy carrier force looking for the American flat tops. The Battle of Midway was about to begin, and Yorktown was about to find out if 72 hours of frantic repairs could stand up to Japanese bombs and torpedoes. Lieutenant Commander Oscar Peterson led Yorktown's fighter squadron, 12 F-4F Wildcats circling above the carrier in a combat air patrol. Through his radio headset, he heard the fighter director officer calling out ranges and bearings to the incoming Japanese strike. They were coming in high, probably dive bombers from one of the Japanese carriers. Peterson pushed his throttle forward and began climbing, his wingman tucked in close beside him. The Japanese found all 3 American carriers that morning, but they focused their attention on Yorktown. Maybe they recognized her from Coral Sea. Maybe she was just the unlucky one, positioned slightly ahead of the other 2 carriers. Either way, at 12:10 p.m., 18 HED-3A dive bombers pushed over into their attack runs, screaming down through anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with black puffs of exploding shells. Buckmaster stood on the bridge, watching the enemy aircraft come. There was nothing he could do now except trust his crew and the work those Pearl Harbor welders had done. The carrier heeled into a hard turn, trying to throw off the dive bomber's aim. Her 5-inch guns hammered away, joined by the rapid-fire chatter of 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft mounts. One bomber exploded in midair, another trailed smoke and veered away, its pilot slumped in the cockpit. But the rest kept coming. The first bomb hit at 12:11 p.m., striking Yorktown's flight deck just after the island's superstructure. The 55-pound weapon punched through the newly installed teak planking and the steel deck plates beneath, the same section that had been hastily repaired in Pearl Harbor before detonating in the carrier's uptakes. The explosion severed the main steam line to boiler number 1 and filled 3 fire rooms with thick black smoke. Lieutenant Junior Grade Milton Tootle was in damage control central when the hit registered on his board. Lights flickered, the ship lurched, then reports started flooding in over the sound-powered phones. Fire in the uptakes, steam pressure dropping across all boilers, speed falling off rapidly. "Counter-flooding ready on my mark," Tootle called out, preparing for the list he knew would come. But the list never came. The bomb had hit almost directly on the center line. Yorktown stayed level as she slowed, her speed dropping from 24 knots to 20, then 15, then 6. On the bridge, Buckmaster watched his ship lose momentum like a car running out of gas. The bomb had done exactly what the Pearl Harbor engineers had feared. It had struck the patch section, found the weaknesses in the rushed repair work, and exploited them. The severed steam lines couldn't be quickly fixed, not out here, not in the middle of a battle. But even as Yorktown slowed to a crawl, her damage control parties were already moving. Chief Kleinsmith found himself back in the fire rooms, back in the smoke and heat, directing men through the same kind of emergency repairs they'd executed at Coral Sea. The difference was they'd had 3 hours at Coral Sea. Now they had maybe 30 minutes before the Japanese came back. The second bomb hit at 12:13 p.m., penetrating the flight deck near the forward elevator and detonating in the hangar bay. The blast ripped through a gasoline storage tank and started fires that raced across the hangar deck, consuming parked aircraft and threatening the forward magazines. The third bomb followed 20 seconds later, hitting further aft and starting more fires. Yorktown was burning and dead in the water. Damage control parties attacked the fires with hoses and foam, working in spaces filled with smoke so thick they could barely see their hands in front of their faces. Aviation crews pushed burning aircraft over the side, their paint blistering from the heat. In the engineering spaces, repair crews worked frantically to restore steam pressure, knowing the carrier was a sitting duck without power. Commander Aldrich coordinated the response from Damage Control Central, directing teams to the worst fires, rerouting power around damaged sections, making split-second decisions about which systems to save and which to abandon. The Pearl Harbor repairs were holding in some places, failing in others. A bulkhead strengthened with I-beams held firm against the blast pressure. A hastily welded steam line ruptured, scalding 2 men with superheated vapor. At 12:40 p.m., incredibly, engineers restored enough steam pressure to get Yorktown moving again. Not fast, not even close to her theoretical maximum, but 18 knots was enough to conduct flight operations, enough to maneuver, enough to stay alive. Buckmaster ordered the carrier back into the wind to recover aircraft. Finders landed on a deck still smoking from bomb hits, their wheels touching down on teak planking scorched black by fire. The crew began to think they might actually survive this. Then at 2:35 p.m., the lookout spotted torpedo wakes. 6 Japanese Kate torpedo bombers from the carrier Hiryu had found Yorktown and were pressing their attack through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. 2 went down immediately, torn apart by 5-inch shells. A third staggered away, trailing smoke. But the remaining 3 bored in, dropping their torpedoes at ranges so close the pilots could see individual sailors on Yorktown's deck. Buckmaster ordered the carrier hard to port, trying to comb the tracks, trying to present the narrowest possible target. It wasn't enough. 2 torpedoes struck the port side within seconds of each other, the double hammer blow lifting the massive carrier and slamming her back down into the ocean. The first hit below the armor belt near the front engine room. The second struck further aft, flooding the aft engine room and additional fire rooms. This time the damage was catastrophic. The torpedo hits knocked out all power. The lights went out throughout the ship, plunging interior spaces into absolute darkness. The list came almost immediately, the port side dipping down as seawater poured through the ruptured hull. 4 degrees, 7 degrees, 10 degrees. The carrier was rolling over, and there was nothing the damage control parties could do to stop it. In the fire rooms, men struggled through waist-deep water in complete darkness trying to reach escape hatches before the flooding overtook them. Some made it, others didn't. The concussion from the torpedoes had sprung hull plates weakened by the hasty Pearl Harbor repairs, creating new flooding paths the damage control teams couldn't seal quickly enough. Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship at 3 p.m. It was the hardest decision of his career, but the mathematics were inescapable. Yorktown was listing 17 degrees to port and still going over. Her engineering spaces were flooded, she had no power, no pumps, no way to fight back against the ocean claiming her. Sailors went over the side into the warm Pacific water, swimming away from the dying carrier. Destroyers moved in close to pick up survivors, their crews throwing lines and cargo nets over the side. Buckmaster was the last man to leave, walking down the slanted deck to the low side and stepping off into the water at 5 p.m. Behind him, Yorktown lay on her side like a wounded whale, her flight deck awash, her island superstructure nearly horizontal. But she didn't think.
Through the night, Yorktown floated. The list stabilized at 23 degrees. The flooding slowed as seawater pressure equalized inside and outside the hull. By dawn on June 5th, the carrier was still there, still floating, visible for miles across the empty ocean. Buckmaster stood on the deck of the destroyer Hammond, staring at his ship through binoculars. She looked dead, but she wasn't sinking. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from the cruiser Astoria, made a decision that morning that surprised nearly everyone. He ordered a salvage attempt. Yorktown had survived the night against all odds. Maybe, just maybe, she could be saved. The nearest dry dock was still 3,000 miles away in Pearl Harbor, but if they could get her moving under tow, if the Japanese didn't come back, if the weather held, and a dozen other things went right, they might get her home. It was a long shot. Everyone knew it. But this was a carrier that had already defied the odds twice, surviving Coral Sea when she should have gone down, getting patched up in 72 hours when she needed 3 months, fighting at Midway when she should have been in dry dock. One more miracle didn't seem completely impossible. On the morning of June 6th, salvage parties went back aboard. Lieutenant Commander Aldridge led a team of 29 officers and men who climbed rope ladders up the listing hull and onto the slanted flight deck. The carrier was eerily quiet after 2 days of abandonment. Water sloshed in flooded compartments. Small fires still smoldered in isolated spaces. Personal effects lay scattered where men had dropped them during the evacuation. Photographs, letters from home, coffee cups still sitting on tables in the wardroom. The salvage team got to work. They rigged emergency pumps powered by generators brought over from Hammond, which tied up alongside the crippled carrier. They opened hatches to ventilate smoke-filled compartments. They assessed the damage, trying to determine if Yorktown could actually be saved or if this was a fool's errand that would only get more men killed. The torpedo damage was worse than the bomb hits at Coral Sea, worse than the 3 bombs at Midway. The 2 torpedoes had opened the port side like a can opener, flooding spaces that stretched along 70 feet of the hull. The Pearl Harbor patches had held in some areas, failed in others. Equipment that should have been replaced had failed under stress, but the basic structure of the ship, her keel and frame, remained intact. If they could pump out enough water, if they could restore some stability, if they could get a tow line rigged, there was a chance. By noon, they had pumps running and were slowly gaining ground on the flooding. The list had actually improved slightly, dropping from 23 degrees to 22 degrees. It was marginal progress, but it was progress. Hammond's generators hummed steadily, powering the pumps that were keeping Yorktown alive 1 gallon at a time. Then, at 1:30 p.m., a lookout on one of the escorting destroyers spotted a periscope. The Japanese submarine I-168 had been stalking the task force for 2 days, waiting for an opportunity. Commander Yahachi Tanabe had found his targets, a crippled American carrier dead in the water and a destroyer tied up alongside, both sitting ducks. He maneuvered into position at periscope depth, took his time lining up the shot, and fired 4 torpedoes at a range of less than 1,000 yards. The destroyers screening Yorktown went to general quarters, charging toward the periscope, dropping depth charges that sent geysers of white water erupting into the air. But Tanabe's torpedoes were already running. The men aboard Yorktown never saw them coming. They were deep in the hull working pumps when the first torpedo struck. It hit Hammond directly amidships, breaking the destroyer's back. The 2,100-ton warship folded in half like a jackknife, her bow and stern lifting out of the water as her midsection collapsed. She sank in 4 minutes, taking 80 men down with her. The depth charges she'd been carrying on her stern exploded as she went down, the underwater detonations killing more men who'd made it off the ship and were swimming in the water. 2 more torpedoes hit Yorktown. One struck near where the original Coral Sea torpedo had hit, finding hull structure that had been weakened by 3 separate damage incidents. The other hit further forward, flooding additional compartments that the salvage team had just started to pump out. The carrier shuddered with each impact, groaning like a living thing in pain. Aldridge felt the deck shift beneath his feet. The list increased immediately. 22 degrees became 24, then 26. Water was pouring in faster than the pumps could handle, and with Hammond gone, they'd lost half their pumping capacity anyway. He looked at the men around him, saw the same realization on their faces. The salvage attempt was over. "Abandon ship," he ordered quietly. "Everyone off, now." The salvage team went back over the side for the second time in 3 days. They climbed down rope ladders and jumped into the water, swimming away as destroyers moved in to pick them up. One officer, Lieutenant A.C. Emerson, was the last to leave. He walked down the slanted deck to the port rail, which was now almost level with the water, and stepped off. Behind him, Yorktown began her final roll. But again, she didn't sink quickly. The carrier hung on through the afternoon and into the evening, her list increasing degree by degree. It finally capsized just after 5 a.m. on June 7th, rolling completely over so her flight deck faced the ocean floor. For a few minutes, she floated upside down, her barnacle-covered bottom exposed to the dawn light. Then, slowly, majestically, she slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. Yorktown's loss sent shockwaves through the Navy, not because carriers couldn't be sunk. Lexington at Coral Sea had proven they were mortal, but because this particular carrier had refused to die easily. It had taken a torpedo and a bomb at Coral Sea and kept fighting. It had been patched up in 72 hours and sailed back into combat. It fought at Midway when she should have been in dry dock. One more torpedo across 2 separate attacks was finally sent her down. The crews who'd served aboard her, the men who'd fought to save her 3 times in 5 weeks, came away with a new understanding of what a warship could endure. They'd seen damage control executed at its highest level, seen engineering miracles performed with portable pumps and welding torches, seen a ship survive wounds that by every reasonable measure should have been fatal. But Yorktown's story didn't end at the bottom of the Pacific. Her survival at Coral Sea and her extraordinary 72-hour resurrection became case studies at every damage control school in the Navy. What Pearl Harbor Navy Yard had accomplished in 3 days became the template for future emergency repairs. The lessons learned from keeping Yorktown fighting, the importance of redundant systems, the value of well-trained damage control parties, the necessity of industrial depth to support a fighting fleet, shaped American naval doctrine for the rest of the war. And there was another carrier whose story would prove those lessons even more dramatically. USS Franklin CV-13 was an Essex-class fleet carrier, larger and more modern than Yorktown. It joined the Pacific Fleet in mid-1944, participating in strikes against Japanese-held islands as the American advance pushed westward. By March 1945, Franklin was positioned 50 miles off the Japanese coast, preparing to launch a strike. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft fully fueled and armed with bombs and rockets. Pilots sat in their cockpits running through pre-flight checks. Deck crews scurried between planes making final adjustments. It was 7:08 a.m. when a single Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber emerged from the low cloud cover, undetected by radar or lookouts until it was almost directly overhead. The pilot released 2 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs from less than 1,000 yards. Both hit. The first struck the flight deck aft of the island, penetrating to the hangar deck below. The second hit near the after elevator. The bombs detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft, and Franklin's hangar deck became an inferno. What happened next made Yorktown's damage at Coral Sea and Midway look almost manageable by comparison. The explosions touched off a chain reaction of detonating bombs, rockets, and aviation fuel. 31 aircraft on the hangar deck were consumed in the first minute. The fire spread to the flight deck, igniting the planes waiting to launch. Rockets screamed across the deck, hitting the island's superstructure and killing men at their stations. Bombs cooked off in the heat, each detonation feeding the firestorm. Lieutenant Commander Joseph O'Callaghan, the Catholic chaplain of the carrier, found himself in a scene from hell. The hangar deck was a solid wall of flame from bow to stern. Men were on fire, stumbling through smoke so thick it was like trying to see through ink.
O'Callaghan grabbed a fire hose and led a damage control party toward the flames, not because he knew anything about firefighting, but because someone had to do it and everyone else seemed stunned into paralysis.
Commander Stephen Jurica, Franklin's intelligence officer, was in his stateroom when the bombs hit. The blast threw him across the compartment. He stumbled out into a passageway filled with smoke and screaming men. The ship was listing 8 degrees to starboard, and he could feel her losing speed. Through a porthole, he saw the ocean impossibly close. The carrier was down by the stern, settling in the water. Captain Leslie Gers stood on the bridge, receiving damage reports that got worse with each transmission. The hangar deck was completely engulfed. Fires were spreading to the gallery deck and multiple interior spaces. Magazines were threatened. The ship had lost all power aft of the island. She was dead in the water, 300 miles from the nearest friendly base, 50 miles from the Japanese coast. The casualties were staggering. In the first 10 minutes, more than 300 men were killed by the initial explosions and the fires that followed. The after part of the ship was an inferno that damage control parties couldn't even approach. Franklin began to list more severely as firefighting water accumulated on the starboard side. 14 degrees, 14 degrees. The carrier was starting to roll over, just like Yorktown had. At 7:32 a.m., Gers gave the order to prepare to abandon ship. It seemed inevitable. Franklin was burning from stem to stern, listing badly, dead in the water within easy range of Japanese land-based aircraft. Every precedent said she was finished. But then something remarkable happened. The same thing that had happened aboard Yorktown, at Coral Sea, at Pearl Harbor, at Midway. The crew refused to let their ship die. Commander Jurica organized parties to jettison ordnance before it could detonate. Men formed human chains, passing 500-pound bombs hand to hand across the canted deck and heaving them over the side. They were handling live explosives, heated to temperatures where they could cook off at any second, working on a deck slick with fuel oil and tilted at an angle that made every step treacherous. Some of the bombs were too hot to touch with bare hands. They used asbestos gloves, cloth wrapping, anything they could find. One bomb slipped from a sailor's grip and rolled toward the edge. 3 men dove after it, caught it before it went over, and carefully lowered it into the ocean. On the hangar deck, O'Callaghan's firefighting party gained their first foothold against the flames. They couldn't extinguish the fires, there was too much burning fuel, too many secondary explosions, but they could contain them. Keep them from spreading to the forward magazines, keep them away from the remaining aviation fuel tanks. The chaplain moved through spaces where the steel deck plates were hot enough to burn through boot soles, directing hose keams, pulling wounded men out of smoke-filled compartments, administering last rites to those who couldn't be saved. In the engineering spaces, Lieutenant Commander McGregor Kilpatrick and his Black Gang worked to restore power. The bombs had severed main power cables and knocked out generators. Kilpatrick's men spliced cables by flashlight, bypassed damaged systems, and cannibalized parts from non-essential equipment to repair critical machinery. By 8:15 a.m., they had emergency power restored to some sections. By 9 a.m., they had one propeller shaft turning. Franklin began to move at 3 knots, barely faster than a walking pace, but moving nonetheless. The list was the most dangerous problem. 14 degrees and increasing as firefighting water accumulated on the starboard side. If Franklin rolled past 20 degrees, she'd probably keep going and capsize like Yorktown nearly had. Commander Jurica organized counter-flooding on the port side, deliberately flooding compartments to bring the ship back to level. It was a calculated risk, adding more water to an already damaged ship, but it worked. The list stabilized at 13 degrees, then began to decrease. 12 degrees, 11. By 10 a.m., Franklin was almost level again. The cruiser USS Santa Fe pulled alongside at 8:30 a.m., coming so close her hull scraped against Franklin's. It was incredibly dangerous seamanship, one wrong move and both ships could be damaged, but Captain Harold Fitz was determined to help. Santa Fe's crew rigged hoses and began pumping water onto Franklin's fires. They took off wounded men, more than 800 of them transferred across on wire cables, while both ships moved through the water. Some of Franklin's crew, convinced the carrier was doomed, jumped across to Santa Fe. Others stayed, committed to saving their ship. By noon, the fires were under control.
Not out, they'd burn in isolated pockets for another 12 hours, but contained. The hangar deck was a twisted wreck of melted aluminum and charred steel. But the fires weren't spreading. Franklin was still afloat, still moving under her own power, slowly picking up speed as engineers brought more systems back online. 4 knots became 6, then 8. The Japanese remarkably didn't come back. Maybe they assumed one bomb hit would be enough. Maybe they thought Franklin had already sunk. Either way, the crippled carrier had a window to escape, and Captain Gears intended to use it. Franklin turned east, away from the Japanese coast, escorted by Santa Fe and several destroyers. Her speed increased to 12 knots by evening, then 15 by midnight. She was heading for Ulithi, the forward fleet anchorage, over 1,000 miles away. The voyage took 4 days. Franklin made it to Ulithi on March 23rd, then continued to Pearl Harbor, arriving April 3rd. She'd traveled more than 4,000 miles with a gutted hangar deck, severe structural damage, and jury-rigged repairs holding her together. The casualty list was horrific. 724 dead, 265 wounded. It was the worst loss of life on any surviving U.S. warship in the entire war. But she had survived, against odds that made even Yorktown's survival seem probable by comparison. Franklin had refused to sink. She'd taken damage that would have killed most warships instantly and remained afloat through sheer determination and damage control expertise. The lessons learned from Yorktown, the importance of trained damage control parties, the value of redundant systems, and the necessity of never giving up the ship had saved Franklin. When Franklin arrived at the New York Naval Shipyard for repairs in April 1945, inspectors found damage that defied belief. The hangar deck had been heated to temperatures that weakened structural steel. Frame members were bent and twisted. Deck plates had melted and fused together. The aft third of the ship was essentially destroyed, requiring complete reconstruction. Repairs took until February 1946, long after the war ended. But Franklin's survival became legendary. Proof of what could be achieved when industrial depth that Admiral Nimitz had counted on when he sent Yorktown back into action after 72 hours of repairs came together with sheer human determination. She'd proven that even catastrophic damage didn't have to be fatal if the crew refused to quit. Franklin and Yorktown became the famous stories, the carriers whose survival seemed miraculous. But they weren't alone. Across the Pacific, other American carriers absorbed punishment that should have sent them to the bottom, but yet somehow made it home. Each survival story added to a growing body of knowledge about damage control, about what ships could endure, about how far determination and skill could push the boundaries of what seemed possible. USS Enterprise, the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy, earned its reputation by refusing to die. It fought in nearly every major engagement of the Pacific War and was hit repeatedly. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, a Japanese bomb penetrated its flight deck and detonated on the third deck, killing 35 men and starting fires that threatened its forward magazines. Damage control parties extinguished the fires in under an hour. Enterprise continued launching and recovering aircraft while smoke was still pouring from the wound. 2 months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz, Enterprise took 3 bomb hits in 4 minutes. One bomb struck near the forward elevator, blowing a hole 10 feet across in the flight deck. Another hit near the aft elevator, starting fires in multiple spaces. The third penetrated to the third deck before detonating, killing 44 men instantly. The carrier's forward elevator was jammed in the down position, a twisted mass of metal that blocked access to the hangar bay. Her flight deck looked like it had been worked over with a giant sledgehammer. Lieutenant Robin Lindsay led repair crews onto the flight deck while anti-aircraft guns were still firing at Japanese planes circling overhead. They couldn't fix the forward elevator, so they worked around it. Welders cut away twisted plating, steelworkers fabricated patches from sheet metal stored in the ship's machine shop. Within 2 hours, Enterprise was recovering aircraft again, landing them on the undamaged portions of the flight deck while fires were still burning below. It shipped to Noumea for repairs, spent 2 weeks getting patched up with the same kind of emergency work that Pearl Harbor had performed on Yorktown, and returned to combat. By war end, Enterprise had taken 16 bomb hits, absorbed damage from multiple kamikaze attacks, and earned 20 battle stars. She became a symbol of American carrier resilience, the ship that simply would not sink, no matter what the Japanese threw at her. USS Saratoga took torpedoes twice
and kept coming back. In January 1942, a Japanese submarine torpedo struck her sideboard, flooding 3 fire rooms and knocking out power throughout the ship. Emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor took 3 months, but when she returned to service, her crew had learned every trick in the damage control manual. When another submarine torpedo hit her in August 1942, they had her repaired and underway again in a fraction of the time. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, Saratoga absorbed 6 kamikaze hits in 3 minutes. The suicide planes crashed into her flight deck one after another, each one carrying bombs that detonated on impact. Fires consumed the forward part of the ship, the flight deck was torn open in multiple locations, 123 men died in the attacks. But Saratoga's crew fought the fires, controlled the flooding, and kept their ship afloat. It made it back to the United States under her own power, was repaired, and was preparing to return to combat when the war ended.